He told me I was a lost cause, that my file was too complicated, my case too far gone for any meaningful intervention. He refused to even see me as a patient, turning my family away at his clinic door with a cold, dismissive finality. We left that day shrouded in a despair so thick it felt like a physical weight, crushing our last shred of hope into dust. I was just a girl with a terminal diagnosis, and he was the brilliant, renowned specialist who had slammed the only door we thought could lead to a miracle. But then, something inexplicable happened. He showed up at our home. He stood on our porch, not as the untouchable doctor, but as a man visibly shaken, his earlier certainty completely gone. What he did next, the words he spoke to my stunned parents, left them utterly speechless and changed the entire trajectory of my life. My name is Florence, and this is the story of how the man who refused to save me ended up fighting for me in a way no one ever could have predicted. My life before that devastating day at his clinic was painted in the soft, fading hues of a long and exhausting battle. For years, our small apartment in a quiet Chicago suburb had been transformed from a home into a makeshift hospital ward, a place where the scent of antiseptic often overpowered the smell of my mother's cooking. I was 16, but I felt 100 years old, my body a landscape of scars from surgeries, and my veins a roadmap of failed treatments. The initial diagnosis of a rare, aggressive bone cancer had been a sucker punch, but the years that followed were a slow, grinding war of attrition against an enemy that seemed to learn our every move before we made it. My parents, Maria and Roberto, were my entire army. My mother, with her hands perpetually chapped from washing them raw, and her eyes holding a quiet storm of worry. My father, a mechanic whose strong hands could rebuild an engine, but were powerless to fix his only daughter, his optimism slowly being chipped away with every negative scan, every new metastasis. We were running out of options, our list of potential treatments dwindling to near zero, when Dr. Alistair Finch's name surfaced. He wasn't just another oncologist. He was a legend, a pioneer in targeted therapies for complex pediatric cancers. A man spoken about in hospital corridors with a kind of reverent awe. He was our Hail Mary, the last possible miracle worker on a list that had no other names left. Getting a referral to him felt like trying to get an audience with the Pope, a process filled with bureaucratic hurdles and endless waiting. But my mother, with the ferocity of a lioness, moved mountains. She spent weeks on the phone, pleading with secretaries, faxing and refaxing my massive medical file, a thick, depressing novel of my illness. When the email finally arrived confirming my consultation, it was as if a single, brilliant shaft of sunlight had broken through the heavy, oppressive clouds that had hung over our family for years. We celebrated that night with my favorite meal, a simple pasta dish, and for the first time in a long time, we talked about the future, not as a terrifying unknown, but as something that might actually exist for me. The morning of the appointment, my mother helped me get dressed with extra care, choosing a bright yellow sweater she said made me look vibrant, alive. She was trying to mask the pallor of my skin, the way my clothes hung loosely on my frame. The drive to his prestigious downtown clinic was silent, filled with a tense, hopeful anticipation. I stared out the window at the bustling city, wondering if the man we were about to meet held the key to me ever being a normal part of that world again. The clinic itself was intimidating in its sleek, sterile perfection. It smelled of expensive cleaning products and quiet money, a stark contrast to the crowded, overworked public hospital we were used to. We sat in the plush waiting room, my father nervously jiggling his knee, my mother clutching my hand too tightly, as if she could physically transfer her strength into me. We watched other families come and go, their faces a confusing mix of anxiety and relief. And we waited for our name to be called, for our turn to meet the man who could, we believed, save my life. That wait felt like an eternity, each tick of the minimalist clock on the wall echoing in the profound silence we were too afraid to break. Finally, a nurse in crisp white scrubs called my name, her voice a neutral, professional tone that gave nothing away. We stood, a trio of trembling hope, and followed her down a hallway so quiet our footsteps were the only sound. She led us not to an examination room, but to a spacious corner office with a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. The room was dominated by a massive dark wood desk, behind which sat Dr. Alastair Finch. He was younger than I had imagined, with sharp, intelligent features and hair that was just beginning to silver at the temples. He didn't smile as we entered. He didn't stand. His eyes were fixed on a thick, open folder on his desk. My folder. My entire, painful history laid bare in black and white. My mother began her rehearsed speech, her voice quivering with a mixture of reverence and desperation. Dr. Finch, thank you so much for seeing us. We've heard incredible things about your work with cases like Florence's. She gestured towards me, as if presenting a precious, albeit broken, artifact. He held up a single hand, a gesture so abrupt it silenced her instantly. His eyes never left the pages. Please, have a seat, he said. His voice, cool and devoid of any warmth. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. We sat in the plush chairs facing his desk, feeling like defendants in a courtroom awaiting a verdict. The seconds stretched out, filled only by the soft rustle of him turning pages. He would occasionally pause, his brow furrowing slightly, and make a small, unintelligible note on a legal pad. The hope that had buoyed us into the room began to slowly leak out, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't the compassionate, miracle-working savior we had built up in our minds. This was a scientist analyzing a deeply flawed experiment. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes, he finally looked up. His gaze swept over my parents and then landed on me. It was a clinical, assessing look, the kind I'd received from 100 other doctors. It was a look that saw a disease, not a person. I've reviewed Florence's case extensively, he began. The initial osteosarcoma, the metastasis to the lungs, the failed rounds of high-dose chemotherapy, the experimental immunotherapy trial that was halted due to progressive disease, the spinal lesions. He listed my failures like a grocery list, each one a hammer blow to my spirit. My father leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. That's why we're here, Doctor. We've been told you have new methods, targeted approaches that others don't. We're willing to try anything. Dr. Finch leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. Mr. and Mrs. Silva, I appreciate your tenacity, but medicine, despite what you may hope, is not magic. It is a science of probabilities, of data, of realistic outcomes. He tapped a finger on my file. This data is not promising. The cancer has shown itself to be remarkably resilient and adaptive. It has survived every line of attack you've thrown at it. The tumor burden is now extensive, and her body is significantly weakened from years of toxic treatments. My mother's breath hitched. But there must be something, a new drug, a different combination. You're our last hope. That's when he said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks, words that felt like a physical ice pick to the heart. I cannot, in good conscience, accept Florence as a patient. The air left the room. My mother made a small, choked sound. "What? Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Dr. Finch's expression remained impassive, almost bored. To put it bluntly, her case is too far gone. The likelihood of any meaningful response to any treatment I could offer is statistically negligible. We're talking about a fraction of a percentage point. Pursuing aggressive treatment now would only serve to diminish what little quality of life she has left. It would be an exercise in futility, causing more suffering for no measurable gain. He spoke about my life, my potential suffering. My future was a decimal point he found insignificant. My focus, he continued, is on patients where my interventions can actually make a difference, where there is a viable path to remission. I'm sorry, but Florence does not fit that profile. She is, for all intents and purposes, a terminal case. My advice to you is to discontinue curative efforts and focus on palliative care. Make her comfortable. Enjoy the time you have left. He closed my folder with a definitive thud. The sound was like a coffin lid slamming shut. The consultation was over. It had lasted less than 15 minutes. My father, usually so stoic, had tears streaming silently down his face. My mother was shaking, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. You won't even try?" she asked, her voice a raw, wounded thing. Dr. Finch stood up, a clear signal for us to leave. Trying, in this instance, would be medical malpractice. It would be giving you false hope. I am saving you from a far greater pain down the line. My secretary will see you out. He didn't look at me again. We were dismissed. We stumbled out of that office, out of that pristine clinic, and back into the glaring afternoon sun. The world outside was still moving, cars honking, people laughing, life going on. But for us, it had just stopped. The ride home was a silent, tear-filled vacuum. The bright yellow sweater my mother had chosen with so much hope now felt like a cruel joke. We had gone to see a god, and he had told us we were not worthy of a miracle. I often think back to that car ride, to the suffocating silence that was heavier than any noise. It's strange how a single moment can shatter your entire world. I wonder if any of you have ever felt that kind of profound disappointment, where the one person you thought could help you closes the door in your face. If you've ever had your hope taken from you, I'd really love to know where in the world you were when it happened. Sometimes just sharing the name of your city, the backdrop to your own difficult moment, can make the memory feel a little less lonely. The days that followed our return from Dr. Finch's clinic blurred into a single gray expanse of grief. The hope that had once animated our small apartment had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, silent shell. My mother moved through the rooms like a ghost, her eyes red-rimmed and distant, mechanically preparing meals that none of us had the heart to eat. My father retreated into a shell of quiet despair, spending hours in the garage, not fixing cars, but just sitting in the driver's seat of his old sedan, staring at nothing. The focus had officially shifted, just as the doctor had ordered, to palliative care. A hospice nurse started visiting, her presence a kind, gentle, but constant reminder of the finality we were now supposed to accept. She spoke in soft tones about pain management and comfort measures, words that felt like a surrender document we were being forced to sign. I spent most of my time on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the world through our front window. I watched kids my age walk to school, their backpacks heavy with books and futures, and I felt a million miles away from that simple, ordinary life. The pain in my bones was a constant, dull ache, a physical echo of the emotional devastation. I had started to make a list in my head of all the things I would never do: go to my senior prom, learn to drive, graduate, fall in love. I was 17 years old and writing my own obituary from the inside out. It was during one of these afternoons, lost in the bleak landscape of my own thoughts, that I saw him. A sleek, dark car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb in front of our house. For a moment, my heart did a foolish, traitorous leap, thinking it was some other doctor, some last-minute reprieve. But then the driver's door opened, and Dr. Alistair Finch himself stepped out. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It felt like seeing a character from a nightmare step into the waking world. He stood there for a moment, smoothing down his expensive-looking coat, his gaze fixed on our modest home. He looked out of place, a stark, sharp figure against our faded lawn and the chipped paint on the mailbox. What was he doing here? Had he come to check that we were following his orders? To make sure I was dying on schedule? A cold anger, one I didn't know I still had the energy for, stirred inside me. I called out to my parents, my voice a weak croak. "Mom? Dad? He's here." They came into the room, my mother wiping her hands on a dish towel, my father with a smudge of grease on his cheek from the garage. They followed my gaze to the window, and their faces mirrored my own confusion and disbelief. Before any of us could process it, the doorbell rang, a sound so normal and mundane that it felt grotesquely out of context. The three of us just stared at the door, a united front of paralysis. My father was the one who finally moved, his jaw set in a hard line. He walked to the door and opened it, not with a welcoming gesture, but with his body blocking the entrance. Dr. Finch stood on our welcome mat. But the arrogant, untouchable doctor from the clinic was gone. In his place was a man who looked haunted. His shoulders were slightly slumped, his usually impeccable appearance was ruffled, and his eyes, which had been so cold and clinical, now held a turbulent, unreadable emotion. He didn't try to push past my father. He just stood there, exposed on our porch. "Mr. Silva, Mrs. Silva," he began, his voice different. It lacked the polished, rehearsed certainty. It was raw, and it wavered. "I know I am the last person you want to see, and you have every right to slam this door in my face. But I am asking you, please, for 5 minutes of your time." My father didn't move. "You said everything you needed to say at your office, doctor. We got the message loud and clear." My mother came to stand beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a fortress of maternal pain. "Is this about your conscience?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and hurt. "Did you come to make yourself feel better about giving up on our daughter?" Dr. Finch flinched, actually flinched as if her words were a physical blow. "No," he said, and the word was heavy with something that sounded like shame. "This is about my failure, my profound failure." He looked past them, and his eyes found mine, still huddled on the couch. The clinical assessment was gone. For the first time, he was looking at me, Florence, the girl, not just the terminal case. "May I come in?" he asked, his gaze still locked on me. "What I have to say, it concerns Florence directly." The air in our small foyer was thick with tension. My parents exchanged a long, silent look, a conversation held in the language of shared suffering and desperate flickering hope. Against every instinct, against every ounce of pain he had caused us, my father slowly stepped aside. Dr. Finch walked into our home, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of our living room, looking utterly lost, a stranger in the very tragedy he had helped cement. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his words were quiet, but they landed with the force of an earthquake. "I was wrong," he said. This simple statement hung in the air, so unbelievable it took a moment to register. "The day you left my office, I couldn't stop thinking about your case, Florence, about you. It was unprofessional. A doctor must be detached. But your file, your history, your parents' faces, they wouldn't leave me. I went over your scans again late into the night. I reanalyzed every blood panel, every pathology report. I looked at the data not as a statistic, but as the story of a 17-year-old girl who has fought longer and harder than any soldier I've ever known." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure agitation. I was so focused on the statistical probability, on the clean, cold data of failure, that I failed to see the one variable that doesn't fit into any of my models: you. He looked at me, and his eyes were blazing with a new, fierce intensity. Your will, your resilience, the fact that you are still here, still fighting after everything this disease has thrown at you, it's not a statistical anomaly, it's a fact. And I dismissed it. I dismissed you. He turned to my parents, his composure cracking. "I told you there was no hope. I was a coward." It is far easier to reject a difficult case than to risk one's reputation on a long shot, to fail publicly. I hid behind my data and my reputation to protect myself from the potential embarrassment of a futile effort. And in doing so, I committed a far greater sin than medical malpractice. I committed a profound failure of humanity. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "So I am here, on my own time, without the backing of my clinic or my team, to ask you something I have no right to ask. I am here to beg you for a second chance. Not for me, but for Florence. I want to take on your case, pro bono. I want to try a radical, combined approach I've been theorizing about for years, but never had a case or the courage to attempt. The odds are still overwhelmingly against us. It is an immense, terrifying risk. But if you are willing to fight, then I am begging you, let me fight with you. Let me try to become the doctor you thought I was when you first walked into my office." The decision to let Dr. Finch back into our lives was not made lightly. It was a fragile truce built on the shattered remains of our trust, and the air in our home remained thick with a cautious, watchful tension for days afterward. My father, ever the pragmatist, spent hours on the phone with a lawyer friend trying to understand the legal ramifications of this unofficial pro bono arrangement. My mother watched Dr. Finch's every move with the sharp, protective eyes of a hawk. Her forgiveness a distant shore he had not yet reached. But for me, his raw, unexpected apology had cracked open a door I thought was sealed forever. It wasn't hope that flooded in. That feeling was too dangerous, too familiar in its cruelty. It was something quieter, more stubborn, a refusal to surrender without one last definitive battle. The new treatment plan he outlined was as terrifying as it was complex. It wasn't a single magic bullet, but a brutal, multi-pronged assault. It involved an aggressive, high-dose chemotherapy regimen, different from anything I'd had before, designed to scorch the earth of my body. Concurrently, he would administer a targeted radiological therapy to the most aggressive spinal lesions, a delicate process with a high risk of nerve damage. And finally, the most experimental part, a modified version of the very immunotherapy that had failed me before. But this time, he proposed a priming protocol using a powerful immunosuppressant first. A counterintuitive gamble meant to reset my system and allow the new drugs a fighting chance. He was frank about the dangers. "Your body is already weakened, Florence," he explained, spreading charts and scans across our kitchen table. a surreal sight amidst the breakfast crumbs and mail. This protocol is going to push you closer to the brink than you have ever been. The toxicity could cause organ failure. The risk of severe infection will be astronomical. The pain will be significant. He didn't sugarcoat it. This was not a path to a gentle end. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble where the treatment itself could easily be what killed me. The first phase began in a private wing of a research hospital where Dr. Finch had called in a mountain of favors. The chemotherapy was a special kind of hell, a poison that felt like it was hunting every last healthy cell in a scorched earth campaign. The nausea was a constant, rolling tide that no medication could fully quell. And the fatigue was so profound that lifting a spoon to my mouth felt like a Herculean effort. My hair, which had grown back in a thin, wispy cap after my last failed treatment, fell out in clumps on my pillow overnight. But the physical toll was only one layer of the challenge. The emotional whiplash was just as brutal. Dr. Finch was a different man in this setting. The cold, detached specialist was gone, replaced by a fiercely focused, almost obsessive presence. He was there at all hours, often still in his coat at midnight, studying my latest blood work, adjusting dosages with a meticulous, nervous energy. He wasn't just my doctor anymore. He was a general in the trenches with me, and the war was being fought inch by bloody inch inside my veins. This new intensity created a strange dynamic with my parents. They were grateful for his dedication, but they also watched him with a deep-seated fear. Every time my fever spiked or a new alarming side effect emerged, "Is this your doing? Is this the greater pain you warned us about?" One night, after a particularly bad reaction to the immunotherapy left me shaking uncontrollably with chills, my mother finally snapped. She cornered him in the hallway, her voice a low, furious whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. "You said you wouldn't cause her more suffering for no gain. Look at her. What is this if not suffering?" Dr. Finch didn't defend himself. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with an exhaustion that mirrored hers. "Maria," he said, using her first name for the first time, his voice ragged. "I know, I see it, every second of it. And if you want me to stop, I will. I will stop right now. This is your call. It will always be your call." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. She didn't tell him to stop. The second phase, the targeted radiation, brought a new host of complications. The precision required was immense, and the margin for error was virtually zero. I had to be perfectly still, strapped to a cold table while invisible beams focused on my spine. The fatigue deepened, sinking into my bones until even the act of breathing felt like work. Then the infection started. My immune system, deliberately suppressed and then battered by the chemo, was a ghost town with no defenses. A simple cold set me into septic shock. A medical emergency that required a week in the ICU. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of beeping machines and frantic voices. In one lucid moment, I saw Dr. Finch arguing with another senior physician at my bedside. The other doctor was insisting the treatment was too dangerous to continue, that they were now just managing the catastrophic side effects of his hubris. Dr. Finch's face was pale, his fists clenched, but his voice was steady. We knew this was a possibility. We stay the course. I am not giving up on her. It was the first time I truly understood the professional risk he was taking. His reputation, his coveted career, was on the line alongside my life. The most insidious challenge, however, was the one happening inside my own mind. Lying in that sterile bed, feeling my body betray me over and over, the darkness would creep in. A voice that Dr. Finch had once given a clinical platform to would whisper that he had been right the first time, that this was all just a prolonged, more painful way to die, that I was a fool for believing in a redemption arc for a man who had seen my death in a spreadsheet. The fight wasn't just against the cancer anymore. It was a war on two fronts, a battle for my body and a desperate daily struggle for my spirit. I had to consciously choose every single morning to believe in the haunted, determined man who now spent his nights sleeping in a chair in the corner of my room. To trust the fire in his eyes more than I trusted the agony in my bones. The complications were no longer just medical. They were a test of faith, a trial by fire for everyone involved, and we were all being burned. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a terrifying silent stillness. It was 3 a.m, and the only light in my room came from the dim glow of the heart monitor. I had been drifting in a feverish haze for days. The line between dreams and reality blurring into a painful, confusing fog. The latest infection had taken a brutal hold, and my body, pushed far beyond any reasonable limit, was beginning to shut down. My blood pressure was dropping, a slow, insidious slide that no amount of medication seemed able to reverse. Dr. Finch was there, of course, his silhouette a familiar statue in the corner chair, but even his relentless vigilance seemed to be fraying at the edges. I remember the exact moment the change happened. A deep, crushing pressure settled on my chest, a weight so immense it felt like the entire room was collapsing inward. I tried to draw a breath, but my lungs refused to obey, as if they were filled with concrete. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, a clammy, deathly chill that had nothing to do with the fever. The monitor's soft, rhythmic beeping suddenly sharpened into a single, piercing, continuous alarm. The door flew open, and the night nurse rushed in, her eyes wide. But everything was starting to sound distant, muffled, as if I were sinking deep underwater. Dr. Finch was at my side in an instant, his face a mask of controlled panic. "Florence? Florence, look at me!" His voice was sharp, a command trying to cut through the thickening haze. I tried to focus on his eyes, those intense, burning eyes that had become the anchor for this entire terrifying journey, but they were growing dim, receding into a tunnel of shadows. This was it. This was the failure he had predicted, the statistical probability playing out in real time. My body was surrendering. The war was lost. What happened next was a chaotic, desperate ballet of last-ditch efforts. More people flooded into the room, a whirlwind of scrubs and urgent voices. I felt a sharp sting as a new IV line was inserted, a powerful push of medications meant to shock my heart back into a stable rhythm. Someone was bagging me, forcing air into my uncooperative lungs. Through the narrowing tunnel of my vision, I saw Dr. Finch's hands, those steady, brilliant hands, working with a frantic, almost furious speed. He was barking orders, his voice raw with emotion I'd never heard from him before. Pure, unadulterated fear. This wasn't the fear of professional failure. This was the visceral terror of watching a life slip away right in front of him. He wasn't just trying to save his patient, he was fighting for me. For Florence. For the girl he had once turned away and now refused to let go. My parents were ushered out of the room, my mother's choked sob, the last thing I heard clearly before the world dissolved into a formless, gray static. I was floating now, detached from the pain, from the frantic activity around my bed. It was peaceful, in a way. The struggle was finally over. But then, a voice cut through the nothingness. It was Dr. Finch's, but it was stripped bare of all its clinical authority. He was leaning so close to my ear, I could feel his breath. He wasn't reciting medical instructions, he was pleading. Florence, listen to me. You have to fight. Do you hear me? You have to come back. His voice broke. You are not a statistic. You are not a lost cause. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Your parents are right outside. They need you. I need you to fight. Please, don't you dare give up. Not now. Not after all of this. In that moment, hovering between life and whatever comes after, his words were the only real thing. They were a rope thrown into the void. He wasn't just my doctor anymore. He was a man begging for forgiveness, for a chance to prove that his change of heart hadn't come too late. And something in my spirit, that stubborn, resilient part of me that had kept me alive through years of hell, latched onto that rope. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a primal, instinctual response, a final, monumental surge of will. I clawed my way back towards the sound of his voice, towards the pain, towards the fight. The journey back to consciousness was long and arduous. The first thing I was aware of was a profound, all-consuming ache in every single cell of my body. The second was the sound of quiet, relieved weeping. I managed to flutter my eyes open. The room was still dim, but the frantic energy was gone. The piercing alarm had been silenced, replaced by the steady, strong beeping of the heart monitor. My mother was holding one of my hands, her tears falling onto my wrist. My father stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his own face streaked with tears. And standing at the foot of my bed was Dr. Finch. He looked utterly wrecked. His clothes were rumpled, his hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But he was looking at me, and in his gaze was a look of such staggering, overwhelming relief that it brought fresh tears to my own eyes. He didn't say anything. He just gave me a slow, deliberate nod, a silent communication that passed between us, acknowledging the hell we had just walked through together and the simple, miraculous fact that we were both still standing on the other side. The crisis had passed. I had survived the unsurvivable night, but the war was not yet won. We had reached the peak of the mountain, stared into the abyss, and somehow found the strength to take one more step back from the edge. The climax was over, but the fragile, precious life we had fought so desperately for was now cradled in a silence that felt more sacred than any victory cheer. This journey from despair to a fighting chance has been the most profound experience of my life, and it's taught me that our stories, in all their messy, painful, and beautiful detail, are what connect us most deeply. I would be so incredibly honored if you would join our community here by subscribing, and if you feel comfortable. I would love to hear a little piece of your own story in the comments below. Not the whole difficult chapter, just a sentence about a time you found an unexpected strength. Your words can be a light for someone else who is still finding their way in the dark. The days following that harrowing night were a slow, careful ascent from the deepest valley. I was a ghost of myself, so fragile that even the weight of the hospital sheets felt like a burden. But the continuous, steady beep of the monitor was no longer a threat. It was a mantra, a promise that my heart was still beating, that I was still here. Dr. Finch became a permanent, quiet sentinel in my room. The frantic energy of the crisis was gone, replaced by a meticulous, almost reverent attentiveness. He was no longer just fighting a disease. He was meticulously rebuilding the ruins it had left behind. The brutal combination therapy had done its scorched earth work, and now we entered a new, delicate phase of recovery and assessment. It was a period of excruciating patience. Every blood draw was awaited with bated breath, every scan a potential verdict. The first glimmer of tangible hope came about 2 weeks after the crisis. Dr. Finch came into my room holding a fresh printout, and for the first time since I'd known him, a genuine, unguarded smile touched his eyes. "Your white blood cell count is climbing, Florence," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's your own marrow doing the work. It's recovering." It was a small, clinical fact, but in that context, it felt like a miracle. My body, which had been a passive battlefield for so long, was finally, tentatively, joining the fight again. The real turning point, the moment the resolution truly began to crystallize, was the day of the PET scan, the one that would show if the brutal assault on the cancer had worked. The anxiety in the room was a physical presence as I was wheeled down for the procedure. My parents held hands so tightly their fingers were white, and Dr. Finch, who usually maintained a professional distance in these moments, walked alongside my gurney, his hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture of solid, unwavering support. The wait for the results was the longest of my life, stretching out into an agonizing eternity. When Dr. Finch finally walked into the private family room where we were waiting, he was holding the films. He didn't speak immediately. He placed them on the light box on the wall with a deliberate slowness that was pure torture. He clicked the switch, and the ghostly gray and black images of my body illuminated the room. He then, without a word, pulled out the scans from before his radical treatment began and placed them side by side. The difference was not subtle. It was staggering. On the old scans, my bones and lungs were littered with the bright, fiery hotspots of active cancer, a constellation of destruction. On the new scans, those lights were gone, extinguished. In their place was a quiet, uniform gray. There were a few small, residual shadows, scars from the war, but the raging fire was out. The scans show no evidence of metabolically active disease, Dr. Finch said, his voice quiet but resonating with a profound, awestruck certainty. The clinical term hung in the air for a moment before its meaning crashed over us. My mother let out a sound that was half sob, half scream of pure, unadulterated joy, collapsing into my father's arms. My father, the strong, silent mechanic, buried his face in her hair and wept, his whole body shaking with the force of his relief. I just stared at the two images, the before and after, a visual representation of the canyon we had just crossed. I was not cured. The word was still too dangerous, too absolute, but I was in remission. The terminal case had a future. The transition out of the hospital and back into the world was a journey in itself. I was discharged not with a final farewell, but with a detailed long-term care plan and Dr. Finch's personal cell phone number scribbled on a piece of paper. "This isn't the end of our partnership, Florence," he told me as he signed my discharge papers. "It's just the next phase." Our home, which for years had been a place of sickness and sorrow, slowly began to transform back into a home. The hospital bed was returned, the IV poles disappeared, and the scent of antiseptic was gradually replaced by the smell of my mother's cooking and the simple, clean fragrance of laundry. My body was still weak, a vessel patched back together, and I had to learn to walk again, to build my strength one slow, shuffling step at a time. The relationship with Dr. Klein, Finch evolved into something I could never have predicted. He kept his promise. He didn't just hand me off to another oncologist. He became my primary physician, overseeing my long-term follow-up care, with the same intensity he had applied to saving my life. Our appointments were no longer held in his intimidating downtown clinic. He came to our local hospital, or sometimes for quick check-ins, he would even stop by our house. Sitting at our kitchen table just as he had on the day he begged for a second chance. The dynamic between him and my parents softened into a deep, respectful bond forged in shared trauma and ultimate triumph. The wariness in my mother's eyes was replaced by a warm, tearful gratitude, and my father would shake his hand not as a doctor, but as a friend who had helped carry our family through an impossible storm. One afternoon, about 6 months after I returned home, Dr. Finch visited for a routine checkup. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the late summer light filter through the trees. I was finally strong enough to sit outside for more than a few minutes. He finished reviewing my latest blood work, nodded in satisfaction, and then fell into a comfortable silence. "I need you to know something, Florence," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What you went through, it changed the course of my career. It changed me as a man." He told me that he had stepped back from his high-profile, lucrative practice at the prestigious clinic. He had accepted a position leading a research division at a major children's hospital, focusing exclusively on complex, last-hope cases like mine had been. "You taught me that data is only part of the story," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The human spirit, the will to fight, is a variable that can't be quantified. I was so afraid of failure, of tarnishing my perfect record, that I was turning away the very patients who needed the most courage, both from themselves and from their doctor. You gave me that courage." He wasn't the antagonist anymore. He was a man redeemed, his own life's path irrevocably altered by the journey we had taken together. He had found his humanity in the wreckage of my diagnosis, and in doing so, he had given me back my life. The resolution was not just my body healing. It was the healing of a broken trust, the closing of a painful circle, and the beginning of a new story for both of us. One written not in the cold ink of statistics, but in the warm, messy, and miraculous script of second chances. The final chapter of my story isn't one of a sudden, magical cure, but of a slow, deliberate sunrise after the longest and darkest of nights. The remission held, a fragile gift that with each passing month grew stronger, its roots digging deeper into the reality of my life. I celebrated my 18th birthday not in a hospital room, but in our backyard, surrounded by family and a few friends from school I'd slowly reconnected with. Their presence a testament to the ordinary, beautiful life I was being allowed to reclaim. The candles on the cake were a blur as I made a wish, not for health, but for the courage to truly live in this second chance I'd been given. I went back to school, not as the sick girl, but as a survivor. My senior year a mosaic of catching up on missed lessons and savoring the profound joy of walking through the crowded hallways, of hearing the bell ring, of existing in a world that was no longer defined by sickness. I did get to go to my senior prom, my body still thin and my gait a little unsteady, but I danced, feeling the music vibrate through the floor and into my bones, a sensation of pure, unadulterated life that made me cry happy tears right there on the dance floor. I learned to drive, my father patiently guiding me in his old sedan, the same car he had sat in during his darkest hours of despair, now filled with our shared triumphant laughter. I graduated high school, the cap and gown feeling less like a costume and more like a suit of armor I had forged in the fires of my own personal hell. The standing ovation I received as I walked slowly and deliberately to get my diploma wasn't just for me. It was for my parents, for their unwavering love, and, in a way, I think everyone sensed. For the doctor who had dared to believe in a miracle when all the data said it was impossible. Dr. Finch remained a constant, guiding presence throughout it all, the architect of this new life I was building. Our relationship settled into a deep, abiding friendship that transcended the typical doctor-patient dynamic. He was my mentor, my confidant, and a living reminder of the power of redemption. I would visit him at his new research hospital, a place that felt alive with purpose and hope. Not the cold, sterile perfection of his old clinic. His office walls were no longer adorned with just his own degrees, but with drawings from his young patients and photos of survivors. He had indeed dedicated his career to the lost causes, the complex cases other doctors turned away, and he was achieving breakthroughs that were changing the entire field. He often said that my case was the catalyst, the one that broke him open and forced him to become the healer he was always meant to be. He never took credit for my survival. Instead, he always gave it back to me. "You did the work, Florence," he'd say, his voice filled with a respect that went far beyond the clinical. "I just finally learned how to be a proper ally in your fight." On the 1-year anniversary of my remission, he took my parents and me out to dinner. It was a quiet, emotional evening. Over dessert, he slid a small wrapped box across the table to me. Inside was a stethoscope. "A symbol," he said, his eyes glistening. "Not for you to become a doctor, unless you want to, but a reminder that you now have the ability to listen to your own life, to its strength and its rhythm in a way you never could before, and a promise from me that I will always be listening too." So, how did the doctor who refused my case end up fighting for me in a way no one could have predicted? He didn't have a sudden change of heart because of new science or a hidden treatment. He didn't see a miraculous sign. He was haunted. He was haunted by the cold finality in his own voice, by the devastation on my parents' faces, by the quiet dignity with which I, a mere girl, carried a burden he had deemed too heavy for his reputation to bear. My file, a collection of cold, hard data pointing to failure, became a person to him. He saw past the terminal prognosis and into the fierce, unquantifiable will to live that flickered within me. His journey from antagonist to ally was a painful, humbling metamorphosis born not of arrogance, but of a profound crisis of conscience. He had to confront his own fear of failure, his own hubris, and the uncomfortable truth that in his quest for statistical success, he had lost sight of the human spirit at the center of every single data point. His fight for me was his own redemption song, a desperate, all-in gamble to reclaim his own humanity. He fought not with the detached confidence of a master, but with the raw, terrified, and ultimately courageous heart of a man who had everything to lose, not just a patient, but his very soul. He showed up on our porch not as a savior, but as a penitent, offering not a guarantee, but his own vulnerability and a willingness to risk everything alongside us. The moral of this story, the spiritual truth that has been etched onto my heart, is that hope is not a passive thing that is given or taken away by experts. It is a stubborn, resilient seed that can lie dormant in the most barren of soils, waiting for just one person to believe in it enough to water it with their own courage. Our greatest battles are often not won by strength alone, but by the unexpected alliances we form in the trenches, by the capacity for change that exists even in the most hardened of hearts. Dr. Finch taught me that a person is never beyond redemption, and in turn, I showed him that a patient is never beyond hope. Our story is a testament to the fact that the most powerful medicine in the world isn't always found in a vial or a textbook. It is found in the messy, painful, and beautiful act of one human being truly seeing another, in the courage to admit you were wrong, and in the unwavering decision to fight for a miracle, even when every logical part of you screams that it's impossible. My life now is a living, breathing monument to that truth. Every breath I take, every sunrise I see, every dream I now dare to dream is a whisper of gratitude for the journey, for the pain, for the despair, and for the miraculous, unexpected love that ultimately pulled me from the brink. The man who refused to save me ended up giving me back my life, and in the process, he saved a fundamental piece of his own humanity, proving that sometimes the most terminal condition of all is not a disease, but a closed heart, and that the most powerful cure is always, always a second chance.